The morning sun spilled across the valley, stretching golden fingers over a quiet town that had learned to live with two truths. On one side, the picture-perfect image of a lakeside resort built by the local homeowners association, and on the other, the land of a man whose roots ran deeper than the lake itself. His name was Isaiah Turner. To outsiders, he was a tall, weathered man in his late 50s with calloused hands and a steady gaze. To those who knew him well, he was far more. He was history, a caretaker of stories, a man who had inherited not only soil, but dignity. Isaiah's grandfather had purchased that land nearly a century earlier, when buying property was not only rare for a black man, but also a dangerous endeavor. It was a modest stretch, fields, a small barn, and the woods that bordered a natural spring-fed reservoir. That spring had been the heart of the Turner land for generations, providing water to crops and animals, flowing faithfully through seasons, of drought and storm alike. Isaiah's father used to say, "The spring doesn't just water the earth, son. It remembers us. It remembers who we are." When the town began to expand decades later, the HOA saw an opportunity. They eyed the shimmering waters of Isaiah's spring. They began to dream bigger. A lakefront resort, a playground for tourists, a glimmering attraction that could bring in money. They came to Isaiah's family with contracts and promises. His father refused. "The water's not for sale," he told them. "It doesn't belong to you and it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to God, and I'm just a steward." But the HOA had patience, and in time, they built their resort anyway, feeding from the spring's outflow. They maintained the lake, built docks, trimmed the edges with manicured lawns, and decorated the shoreline with pastel-colored cottages. Families swam, children played, and vacationers posted photos online with captions about peace and beauty. Few of them ever wondered about the Turner farm that quietly sat beside it, where the source of that beauty truly came from. Isaiah didn't begrudge them. He tended his land with steady faith. His barn, painted a dull red that faded under the years, stood tall against storms. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. Inside were tools his father had used, feed for his cattle, and boards he had salvaged for repairs. The barn was more than wood and nails. It was memory, shelter, and resilience. Then came the day when everything cracked. It began with a letter, slipped into Isaiah's mailbox. The HOA claimed his barn was an eyesore to resort guests, who didn't like looking at the dilapidated structure when kayaking on the lake. The letter used legal words, sharp and cold. In violation of community standards, Isaiah read it slowly, his jaw tightening. His land was not part of their subdivision. His barn stood long before their bylaws. Still, he ignored it, believing reason would prevail. But the HOA was relentless. 2 more letters came, then a citation. Isaiah refused to bend. Then one morning, while he was away in town, the bulldozers came. Resort officials, backed by hired contractors, rolled onto his property without warning. By the time Isaiah returned, the barn was nothing but splintered, wood and dust. He stood in silence as the machines hummed away, his fists clenched at his sides. They didn't just tear down a building, they tore down a piece of his family's story. That night, Isaiah sat on his porch, staring at the stars. He thought about his grandfather, who had tilled that soil with bare hands. He thought about his father's words. "The spring remembers us." And then his eyes drifted to the dam, the concrete valve system that regulated the water feeding into the HOA's precious lake. It sat quietly at the edge of his property, mostly unnoticed by the people who swam in its sparkling waters. Isaiah had maintained it for decades, ensuring it never clogged, never overflowed. Without his care, the lake would not exist as it did. The thought lingered in his mind like a slow ember. Weeks passed. The HOA sent a perfunctory apology about the barn, paired with a thin envelope of compensation that was more insult than justice. Isaiah didn't cash the check. He nailed it to the wall of what remained of the barn's foundation, a reminder of how little they thought of his dignity. Then one summer evening, while the resort was full of vacationers sipping drinks on porches and children splashing in the shallows, Isaiah walked down to the dam. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and warm earth. He carried a lantern in one hand and the weight of generations in the other. He stood before the valve, the metal cool under his fingers, and for the first time in his life, he allowed anger to guide his decision. He turned it. At first, it was only a whisper, a subtle shift in the current. Then the outflow began to slow, the trickling water narrowing, then stopping altogether. Upstream, the spring still bubbled faithfully on his land, but downstream, the lake grew still. Within days, the resort staff noticed. The lake level dropped inch by inch. Docks that once floated stood crooked in the mud, and boats lay stranded like abandoned toys. The glittering postcard image was dissolving. The HOA panicked. They demanded that Isaiah fix the dam immediately. He received calls, letters, and even visits from officials who had once ignored him. "You don't understand," they said. "This will hurt business. This will hurt the community." Isaiah listened in silence, his eyes steady, his back unbent. For years, they had treated his stewardship as invisible. For years, they had seen the lake as theirs, not his spring. Now, the truth stood exposed. When reporters arrived, because word travels fast in a small town, Isaiah finally spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate, each word carrying the weight of generations. "They took my barn. They took my family's history and crushed it without permission. That barn was more than wood. It was memory. And now they're asking me to protect their lake, the lake that's been drinking from my land all these years. Well, I'm done. My father taught me that this water doesn't belong to them, and it doesn't even belong to me. But I'll be damned if I let anyone steal my dignity while using what's mine without respect." The cameras caught his words, and suddenly, the story was bigger than the resort. It was about ownership. It was about dignity. It was about how often black families had seen their labor, their land, their history stripped away in silence, and how rarely they had the chance to push back. Isaiah became more than one man with a dam. He became a symbol of quiet defiance. And yet under the pride and fire, Isaiah felt the ache of loss every time he walked past the empty spot where his barn had stood. The memory of it haunted him, a reminder that even small victories could not erase old wounds. But as the lake bed cracked and the resort cottages sat in silence, he knew one truth had been restored. They could no longer ignore him. By the second week, the lake was unrecognizable. The mirror that once reflected sunsets had become a dull, muddy bed. Fish gasped in shallow pools, the air heavy with the smell of decay. Vacationers packed their cars and left early, their laughter replaced by muttered complaints. The HOA scrambled, holding emergency meetings, calling in engineers, even petitioning the county for intervention. But each time, the officials reminded them, the dam sat on Isaiah Turner's property, under his control. Isaiah kept to himself, moving through his daily chores with quiet resolve. Neighbors stopped by, some offering sympathy, others urging caution. "They're not going to let this go," one whispered. "They've got money, lawyers, power." Isaiah nodded, but his eyes never wavered. He had faced worse storms before. His father had taught him that when you stand on truth, no man can knock you down. Still, the nights were heavy. Isaiah would sit on the porch, listening to the silence that replaced the croaking frogs and gentle lap of water. He thought of his grandfather's hands carving fence posts, his father's sweat poured into these fields, his mother humming hymns while shelling peas in that barn. All of it seemed to echo now, urging him forward. Dignity is not given, it is kept. The media frenzy grew. Local papers splashed headlines. AOA Lake dries up after land dispute. And one man, one dam, and a fight for respect. Soon, regional outlets arrived, framing Isaiah's story within a much older one. The history of black families who had fought tooth and nail to keep their land when powerful interests tried to push them out. Interviews dug into archives, uncovering how many black farmers had been stripped of property through intimidation, legal loopholes, or outright violence. Isaiah's stand was not just personal. It became part of a larger narrative that resonated far beyond the town. The HOA, embarrassed and desperate, finally requested a meeting. They arrived at Isaiah's porch in suits that looked out of place on a dirt road, their polished shoes catching dust. At the head was Mr. Caldwell, the HOA president, whose letters had first branded Isaiah's barn an eyesore. His voice was strained but practiced. "Mr. Turner, we've come to offer a resolution. We understand that mistakes were made. We'd like to rebuild the barn for you at our expense, as a gesture of good faith. And in exchange, we ask that you reopen the dam. This is hurting everyone." Isaiah studied their faces. He saw no regret, only inconvenience. He let the silence stretch until it pressed against them. Finally, he said, "You didn't destroy my barn because it was an eyesore. You destroyed it because you thought I was invisible. And now you want to buy your way back to comfort. My dignity is not for sale." The men shifted uncomfortably, their rehearsed smiles faltering. Caldwell tried again. "What is it you want then?" Isaiah leaned forward, his voice steady. "I want acknowledgement, not a check, not a new barn that you'll build like a trophy. I want you to admit what you did, out loud in front of the community. I want you to stand where my barn once stood, and tell the truth. Until then, this dam stays shut." The demand rattled them. They left without agreement, their polished shoes retreating across the dusty ground. Word of Isaiah's stance spread quickly. Some in town admired his courage. Others, especially those with money tied to the resort, whispered resentment. But Isaiah never wavered. He knew this was about more than water. It was about history. Too often, truth was buried under convenience. Too often, voices like his grandfather's had been silenced. Not this time. Weeks turned into months. The resort sat empty, its once bright cottages fading under the sun. Businesses that depended on summer crowds struggled. Pressure mounted on the HOA, not only from residents but from the county itself, which had invested in tourism. At last, facing ruin, the HOA agreed. A gathering was called one autumn morning. The sky was clear, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Townspeople came, curious and tense. Reporters lined the edges, cameras ready. At the center stood Isaiah, near the spot where his barn once rose, and across from him, the HOA board in their somber suits. Caldwell stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd. He looked uneasy, but this time there was no shield of paperwork, no legal jargon to hide behind. Today we stand here to acknowledge the wrongs we committed against Mr. Isaiah Turner. We demolished his barn without right, without respect, and without considering the deep history tied to this land. We acted as though his voice did not matter, as though his story could be erased. We were wrong, and for that, we apologize. Not with money, not with promises, but with truth. The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, the HOA's polished veneer cracked, and behind it lay a recognition long overdue. Some in the crowd nodded solemnly, others wiped at their eyes. Isaiah listened, his face unreadable, but inside something shifted. The apology could not rebuild his barn, but it could restore something greater, acknowledgement of his humanity. When Caldwell finished, the silence was thick. Isaiah stepped forward, raising his hand slightly as if to steady the air itself. "You can rebuild wood," he said, his voice firm, "but you can't rebuild memory. My barn is gone, but what you did will not be forgotten." Still, today, you've spoken the truth, and because of that, I will reopen the dam." The crowd exhaled, a ripple of relief. Reporters scribbled furiously. The HOA looked both chastened and grateful. That evening, Isaiah walked once more to the dam. The handle was cool under his palm, the metal stained with time. He turned it slowly, listening as the first gush of water surged forward, racing toward the hollowed lake bed. Hours later, the resort lake began to stir again. It's cracked, earth drinking deeply from the returning flow. But to Isaiah, it wasn't about the lake. It was about standing firm until the truth was spoken. It was about reminding those who had forgotten that dignity could not be bulldozed, that justice was not found in a checkbook, but in acknowledgement of humanity. In the weeks that followed, the HOA did rebuild a barn, not as a favor, but as an act of reparation, under Isaiah's guidance and with his design. This time, it stood not just as a structure, but as a symbol, painted in bold red that seemed to defy the years, and beside it, Isaiah placed a sign carved with his father's words, "The spring remembers us." The lake refilled, families returned, and laughter once again floated across the water. But for those who lived in that town, the story of Isaiah Turner was now part of the land itself. It was told in porches, in churches, and in the quiet spaces where memory lingers. Parents pointed to the barn and spoke of the man who had demanded truth before water, dignity before convenience. Isaiah continued his life as he always had, tending his fields, mending fences, caring for the spring. But sometimes, when he paused at the dam and watched the water flow, he smiled faintly. Not because he had won, in the way the world measured victory, but because he had refused to be invisible. And in that refusal, he had given voice to countless others whose stories had been buried.